Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to the show. On this episode, I'm bringing back one of my favourite guests for a record-breaking 5th appearance. Benjamin van Rooij is a professor of law and society at the University of Amsterdam. But as you'll know if you've listened to any of his previous appearances, he's no ivory-towered academic. Both the subject that he researches and the innovative way he goes about it are very, very human. Because what Benjamin researches and writes about is behavioural law. In other words, the impact that laws have on human behaviour. That makes his research fascinating for all of us as citizens, but particularly for anybody subject to or involved in compliance. Now, I invited Benjamin to come back onto the show to talk about his new research into something called obligation to obey. That's the question of whether we feel obliged to comply with the law just because it's the law. And while we did talk about that and some of the other research that he's doing, we also got into a much wider conversation about compliance, what it's there to do, and the behavioural drivers behind it. And fascinatingly got some insights into Benjamin's own propensity to comply, what drives his intellectual curiosity, and his observations about compliance in the wild. Always want this show to be free-form and for discussions to flow naturally, and this one really did. So if you want to understand a little bit more about compliance, how it works, when it's successful, when it isn't, and some of the drivers that we might not necessarily always think of, this is an episode for you. So please enjoy, as I'm sure you will, my discussion with Professor Benjamin van Rooij on questioning compliance. Benjamin, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's a pleasure to see you again.
I'm so excited to have you back on the show. And one of the questions you and I have spoken about in previous conversations and when we've met is this question of why do we have compliance functions? And I wanted to get your perspective on that.
So I think if you look back at the history of it, it does very much relate back to the US sentencing guidelines and the sort of lenient treatment that corporations get for having a robust compliance and ethics program. And I think that sort of gave birth to this. And I think compliance 1.0, which you also call a defensive compliance, is very much about making sure that you have sort of the things that the regulators want you to have in the idea under the sort of presumption that that gives you a lenient treatment should there, in case something goes wrong. And I think gradually over time, this has developed more into something of substance where compliance is also supposed to reduce and prevent sort of wrongdoing, sort of compliance 2.0. And I think with this, there is a bigger challenge, obviously, there. So sort of the ticking the boxes of what you need to have for the sort of defensive compliance, it's sort of easy to see, but to know even what works to reduce and prevent, and even to measure that and to have evidence of that is much harder. And also to sell it to boards that are paying for your function, maybe even harder because you would have to sort of sell the idea that you can be sure with numbers backing it that it will prevent certain harm.
I mean, what I find astonishing is if you compared it to other disciplines where we're trying to influence human behavior, let's take marketing. We know that advertisements that make no sense whatsoever from a logical perspective, they don't necessarily talk about the product.
Yep.
They'll spend loads of time and money on cartoons or jingles, just stuff that is illogical.
Yep.
We know that that works, and it must work because they spend loads of money on it.
Yep.
And so when we look at that, we would be saying, okay, if you started to take a defensive view to compliance, you would switch off the possibility of doing anything that didn't seem logical and wouldn't look good in the courtroom.
So here's the interesting thing. Marketing has a complete direct link to the bottom line of a profitable organization. So it's trying to sell something. It's also very easy to see what sells and doesn't because you have the outcome number there. So you can always see what works. You can easily see if it works or doesn't work. If it doesn't work, you get rid of it. Compliance is on the cost side of most organizations. So it's a sort of added cost. And it's very hard to sort of see, okay, where does that function, if it is there to prevent, where does it in the end add value? Because it's very hard to prove that compliance is effective. And it's very even harder to prove that compliance is valuable in a sort of dollar sense in terms of how much harm it will present to the organization. So the sort of arguments you can make is sort of worst case. You can point to worst cases of if, for instance, a certain bribery or money laundering practice happens, what the eventual hits, both from, let's say, the legal system as well and the market would be. But it's much harder than to show A, that this will actually happen in the organization, and B, that the compliance program works with that. And here's the real kicker here. What I see from the academic side, if I look at the underlying sort of problems, for instance, if I look at some of the worst scandals like Volkswagen or Wells Fargo or Boeing, when I look what happened there, I see two things. First of all, I see a lot of these organizations have been fine in the longer run economically, which is sort of shocking to think about. Second thing is, if I look at the deep underlying problems, one of the biggest problems they had unrealistic targets. So if you're in compliance and you really want to address those targets, those underlying issues, and really prevent the sort of risk that I see that there is, you would at some point have to convince a CEO and a CFO, for instance, at Wells Fargo, not to have 8 products per client, but maybe to have 2 products per client. So that's a sort of divided by 4 income. That's the sort of things, it's similar with another deep underlying cause that I see, which is people unable to speak out. Sure, we can do some training and speak out, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is empowerment. What does that mean, for instance, in the US? You need to let people unionize. Again, not something you can do from the compliance function. So if I put these things together, I do think that actually achieving compliance as in prevention of bad behavior is very difficult to do because it requires sometimes much larger investments than you think to do. Second, it's very hard to prove that it will add the value. So I do think that the sort of original compliance where it started with liability management, it's much easier to sort of make a cost benefit of that. But it's still based on the assumption that having a robust compliance and management system actually gives you lenient treatment should things go wrong, for instance, in the US jurisdiction, about which we have some doubt as well.
And that's before you even get into the question of whether that's worth doing. Because, as you and I have spoken about before, I always look at it very simplistically and go, we're helping the lawyers, but we wouldn't do the same for IT security people. The easiest thing for IT security people would be not to have anybody having access to systems. Physical security, let's not have any buildings, right? That makes my life easy. And I
Yep.
always look at it and say, actually, is the legal department driving this thing? Go, well, if we go to court or we sit in front of the regulator, then this will make things easier. And that feels a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. And it is, of course, reactive, not preventative.
Sure. And I fully agree with you on the reactive versus preventive. So ideally, I would argue for preventative. The hard thing though is, and I think that goes with all these departments, there is a similarity. So the compliance department or even the legal department doesn't have that much influence. So when I talk, for instance, to general counsels of large international firms, one of the lessons they gave me was, look, we say 80% of the time we say yes, or maybe even 90% of the time. So that few times where we have to say no, people actually listen to us. So it may seem sometimes that compliance drives everything or lawyers, but that's more on the sort of, I would say, annoying part where you have to do a training or you have to do another course. But the deep things where they actually should get involved, where you really want to have a buy-in, it's very hard for them to do. I mean, it's also what I hear from a lot of people in compliance functions or legal functions. When I talk with them about sort of the things they would love to do and to actually reduce liability or even go and prevent things, they also don't get what they want because it is so costly. So I think since we last spoke, I have come to realize that this compliance 1.0 isn't going to go anywhere. I mean, it's going to stay there. And I do think if we're going to do preventative compliance 2.0, we have to take that into account. And I know the two are not always compatible. So yes, liability management may lead that you do senseless training, and I have examples of that in the behavioral code, that may actually work to obstruct prevention. But I don't think it's easily going to go anywhere. So that's just the reality, at least also when I talk to people in practice that we're in.
One of the things I find fascinating about your research is that when we approach the compliance question, organizations think about it, there are what people call tried and tested methods, but actually
Yep.
often they haven't. They've
No.
been used, but they haven't been tested.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
standard that gets applied to anything different is much, we can't change anything because this is the way we do things. And some of that's driven by the regulators, right? And
Yep.
let's give them what they've always seen because that'll keep them happy.
Yep.
But
Yep.
what you're pointing towards, and this is why I think you're opening that box and going, this is actually a bit more complicated. And so when I look at what you do, it's helping to, it's challenging because the more you look at it, the more you realize that there's complexity there. This isn't a simple thing of just, stop doing
Yep.
what you're doing and do this other thing. There isn't a simple
Yep.
answer there.
Yeah. If we had a simple answer to prevent bribery, or to prevent strong industrial pollution or unsafe working conditions or harassment in the workplace, any of these bad things, sure, we could really say we can ditch the sort of reactive and we go full preventative. And I'm 100% for that. But we don't clearly have that. I mean, at least from the science part, I don't clearly see we can do this. And yes, you're right. A lot of these things, they say it's been tried and tested. And what they mean is regulators accept it or prosecutors seem to accept it. And even that, we don't know for sure. There's a new paper coming out at some point of a colleague at University of California, Irvine, and she actually took a deep dive into the data from prosecutors and regulators and looked, does having a robust ethics and compliance system actually get you lenient treatment? And the short answer is no, not really. So even that assumption doesn't seem to be fully there. And there, I think you're right that what's happened is, well, everybody's gotten used to, we need to do something and let's do whatever it is expected from the regulators. And when you talk with Hui Chun, for instance, when she develops part of this operationalization of the guidelines under the sentencing guidelines about the compliance and ethics system, she said that was never meant to be a checklist. That's sort of how it became to be used. And that's where we all are. And I think that's where the interesting thing is to see, okay, what role can science then play? And I think there's one interesting paper that I did a while back that we're still trying to get published because it's not easy on the academic side to get the sort of the right reviewers that understand what we were doing. But it's landed a bit of a bombshell in practice. This is the paper where we compared a long anti-bribery and corruption policy with two short versions and a group of people who didn't read any of the versions. And we thought, okay, maybe we can simplify all of this and go to a short version or even an infographic version. And we looked at to what extent do people who read a long version have better knowledge of the rules there than people who have a shorter version or an infographic version. And the shocking thing is we found there was no difference between these groups and also no difference between these three groups and people who never read the policy. And we first looked at, maybe we're wrong because it's kind of shocking. I mean, people who haven't read something have the same knowledge as people who have read something. So we first thought maybe the questions are too easy or too hard. Then we looked at, is it maybe possible that the people, and this was in a large multinational, that the people in this multinational already knew of the policy, but they didn't, it was new. And then finally, we looked deeper into the data and we found that what best explained knowledge of these rules was people's own norms, what they about bribery, what they held was moral or what they thought others would do. And it's been interesting how this paper landed because I've seen a lot of response to it in LinkedIn and also we're talking with people later. And I see most people sort of what they take from it. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether we do short or long. That's one response. Or other people have said, well, we don't need to do any training because it doesn't matter. And that's sort of both not true. So first of all, we didn't look at training because we only had people read this. And we know from other studies that training only works if it's very interactive and in person. So if it's very costly. So we didn't do that. We didn't do successful training. Second, the real message of the paper is that these social norms are drivers. And we also wrote this up and I think it's important to keep repeating this message. The real lesson in this paper, where I do think science can help, is we can show if you're going to have a population in your company, if you get to understand their own morals and norms, and you find out that these are aligned with your policy, then you're in a good place. You don't need to do much because there's a very low risk. They already know the things, etc. You don't need to do much training. You can just leave it at be. They're probably going to be okay. But if, and this will also be the case, a part of this group, you find their own norms are not aligned, those people need extra attention and they need the more costly sort of interventions like in-person interactive training. And that's sort of a cool thing. I do think we can find some of these aspects where we can improve these existing programs, but it only works if we do more of this sort of research and if we're able to understand it and translate it into practice. But that's just one small bit of a much larger puzzle that I don't think we can easily solve.
And I love that conclusion because it always struck me, if you look at something like induction training, they tell you this is what the company's all about. But we all know from experience that in the same way that if we take a brochure of something or we watch an advert, right, we will then decide based on the reality what we think of it. And so we
Yep.
might get fooled into buying a product. We might get fooled into joining a company. We might be told that a company, but of course, the real induction training starts the moment you leave that session and you're wandering around
Yep.
working out what do they actually do here? How does this work? And so
Yep.
if so, to your
Yep.
point, if there's a
Yep.
massive disconnect between I've been told this place is super ethical in the
Yes.
propaganda video that I
Yes.
watched before I'm allowed to do anything,
Yes.
and then I discover that they're not, which one of the two do you think can I
Yes.
go with?
Yes. Yes.
And so I
I mean,
really like where you're pointing us in this thing because I
yeah.
think there is this bigger problem that we should come and look at. But I think there's some basic primitive things where if we took your findings and just went, huh, is it actually worth our, sometimes is it worth our while spending loads of time creating propaganda videos for induction training? Probably not,
Sure.
right? Because they'll work it
Sure.
out for themselves.
Sure. Well, I mean, on that's a different thing. So I think induction it's a very important and interesting topic. I mean, just to and I'll go back to it in a second. I think what our study was really about, it's about to what extent do people update their knowledge if they read something, or do they update their norms and their morals? And we see they don't. They do. I mean, sort of what they read is filtered through their morals, through what they see as right and wrong. So if they think bribery is wrong, sure, then whatever the company tells them, even if they don't mean it, it'll stick well with what they do, and they're probably going to be okay. But if they think, oh, it's actually okay, then reading something new is not going to immediately counter that. So we're sort of overestimating what that would do. I think what you're saying, it touches on a different point and something that I have seen in some of the worst cases, which is what I call corporate cognitive dissonance. This is the difference between the tone at the top and the smell at the bottom. So sure, I mean, I've sort of done a thought experiment. There's probably hardly any organizations in the world anymore, except maybe the most extreme startups with bro culture, that don't have good values somewhere in the official documents. Probably everybody has them by now. It's not hard to have. And probably in some of them, they have induction videos or trainings, etc., where this is shown to people. The question isn't so much whether people believe those videos or what happens when they then go into the workplace. It is about what happens if you see a disconnect between the official message and the everyday practice. And my idea there is that it means probably at some point you don't believe the official message and you get to understand it as a wink, wink, which means that any messaging, also if it is earnest, is going to be difficult. So a good example for me was what happened at Volkswagen with the emission scandal, and also at BP with their problems in Alaska and also in Texas and later in the Gulf, all leading to unsafe practice. In both instances, you see BP was the first to acknowledge global climate change as linked to fossil fuels. They branded themselves as beyond petrol. They had the green sun. They were all pro-environment, everything. Yet they ended up doing consistent cost cutting of 25% per year. And in that, it was impossible to do the sort of safety and environmental protection in the operations and exploration that they needed to do. Volkswagen, similar. They were clean diesel, all kinds of advertisement, etc. on that. But in the end, what people saw in the everyday life was just, well, we have to build this engine regardless, even though we can't put this sort of uranium tank in it that would actually make it clean. And from that, what you sort of learn is, well, the real goal we have to achieve is the bottom line. It's not safety or the environment. And I think that undermines the long term for anybody to even change things. So I've been thinking, what happens if you're the new CEO in Volkswagen or BP? How long will it take till people take you serious? If for years there's been this sort of opposed messaging. So I think there's a very, very deep problem that's hard to solve because it means you have to win back trust. And I think you only do that by really putting the money where your mouth is. So really, for instance, in BP, stopping having these 25% costs. While you're saying that things are different now, you also really change that. And what happened in the past, they started to have a different language on safety in BP, but didn't really change the bottom line. And again, going back to what I said earlier, that makes compliance way more costly. It means you actually have to change the whole operation of your corporation, not just the value trading, which costs money, but it's very cheap compared to actually doing the right thing.
Wow. I love the way you describe it there. On the one hand, I kind of go, this is all about humans and we must have the wherewithal to solve it. On the other hand, as you point out, there's the complexity, the factors that go into driving the behaviors. There are some obvious ones, like if you reward people in a particular way, they're going to follow the incentives that are put in front of them. But some of these things like social norms, and I know that you've recently been looking, or over a number of years, but you've recently looked again at this obligation to obey laws. I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think that's a really
Yes,
interesting example of, yes, the factors that go into whether people break the law or not.
sure. So one of the most famous books in academia, and I'm pretty sure people in practice have, some people have read this, is by Tom Tyler. And it's called Why People Obey the Law. And he originally published it in 1990, and he had a new version in 2006. And he asked this very basic question in a sort of general population: is why do people obey rules? And he has a focus on criminal law. And he sort of found out that the most important driving factor is if people agree with the rules. And that we can all understand. If you think, for instance, that there's a good reason that we have tax rules, and you really like tax, you're going to be more likely to pay it. You're already smiling because it also shows the problem. We have that many rules and we're that varied in our opinions that we cannot have a legal system based on just people agreeing with the rules for compliance. He then looked at, okay, what is the second most driving factor? And he did this based on surveys he did in the mid 1980s. And he found it wasn't enforcement. It wasn't fear of punishment, which is very much in line with what I've seen in other research. Sure, it doesn't mean that we don't need punishment, but it's just not the core driver. He found one variable stuck out, which was whether people had a sense of obligation to obey these rules simply because they were the rules, regardless of whether they're enforced, regardless of whether other people comply, regardless of whether they themselves agree with the rules. And this is called the perceived obligation to obey the law, or OOL in short, OOL. So if you look at the obligation to obey the law, Tom Tyler then went further and he looked at, okay, what is driving that then? And he found, well, it's linked to the perceived legitimacy of the system, of how the rules are made and enforced. And then he saw, and that has a lot to do with how people perceive the procedural fairness of how rules are enforced or made. So to put it very simple, the way you look at the police and whether the police treat you fairly in their procedures, for instance, whether they let you have voice, whether they treat you with neutrality, factors like this, that was the core driver of people's perception of the legitimacy, and that would drive people's sense of obligation to obey the rules. That's where most of the literature has been and has stayed. Volumes of research. And together with Adam, this is actually how Adam Fine and I started. It was before our book. We sort of asked ourselves, is this all? So if this core important influence, our own sort of personal sense of obligation to obey the rules, can that really only come from the way we look at the legal system? I mean, most people don't have much of an idea of whether they're treated procedurally fair, for instance, by lawmakers. And many people never have that much contact with the police. So could that really be it? So we did a whole bunch of studies and we found there's more at play. So first of all, we find that in our earlier papers, we found that personality traits, very individual things, have a lot to say. So if you have less impulse control, you're less likely to have an obligation to obey the law. If you are more dogmatic, this is one of those other things, or you have what we call moral disengagement, also this affects your obligation to obey the law. So we clearly see that there's individual variation. Second, and this is the more shocking thing, and this came with this paper that just came out, where we looked in different countries. So we thought if it has to do with how people view the legal system, let's look in very different legal systems. So we looked at China, which is the outlier, has very limited rule of law, limited good governance indicators, limited procedural fairness, probably because of that. And we compared China with Israel, the Netherlands, and the US. And we did that in samples of law students because we had colleagues that ran these surveys. And we surprisingly found China was not the outlier. We found there was no significant difference between these countries. And this is sort of shocking when you come at this from the original literature that said, well, procedural fairness is everything. Well, it's not sure that it is. And then we looked at, it doesn't matter what sort of study you do, because we thought maybe students of economics are different from law students. And maybe, I mean, I see you smiling because they have a different way of looking at costs and benefits. Maybe for them, no, sure, I'm never going to just follow the rules just because they're the rules. Now, what I want to do is follow the rules if it comes out in the cost benefit. But we didn't find any significant differences there. So generally speaking, and this is a whole new research project I'm starting now, I can conclusion is A, that obligation to obey the law is a key driver of our behavior. And B, that we don't know enough about variation in it. We know that it's not just procedural fairness. We know it has to do with the individual, but we also know it may have a lot to do with our early life socialization. So we did one study with mothers of adolescents who had been in contact with the law. So 16-year-olds and their mothers, and these 16-year-olds had some criminal problems. And we found, this was also surprising, one of the best predictors of this obligation to obey the law was the relationship between the mothers and the sons. So they scored very similar, pairs of mothers and sons. So there seems something there that it may be biological, which I doubt, but that in the socialization, how you're brought up, that's also playing out. So in a new research project that I'm starting now, first of all, we're going to do a systematic series of studies looking at all kinds of personality aspects, sort of general personality aspects, sort of what sort of general broad personality you have, but also things like impulse control, your morality, your moral reasoning, but also cognitive things, your need for closure, as they call it, or your conscientiousness, etc. Second, we're going to look at different age groups. We're first going to go with adolescents from 12 and then to early adulthood, all the way to 25. But we're also going to go even to children, 5 to 12, where we're going to translate this idea of obligation to obey the law to something that actually kids can answer. And finally, we're going to do a cross-national study, much larger than we did in the 38 OECD countries. So to really understand much more broadly whether these national things, including procedural justice, but also cultural values at the national level, whether they play a role. So that's sort of where we are now.
Wow. What I find really interesting about it is, I mean, you're starting, it's a very simple question you're starting to answer, right? Which is, let's just put it in compliance terms. What drives people to be compliant or not?
Yes.
In the sense of rules, not in the sense of following instructions, I guess.
Yes.
But what you raised there is there's a ton of factors. This is way complicated than we might like to think. And what for me that points towards is many of the simplistic, behind compliance programs and the law, I guess, are some simplistic presumptions. Yes. Sometimes we have to make those, I guess, because your point is, because what you're pointing, I think, is it's not one size fits all. And yet it has to be one size fits all if you're looking at a country or an organization.
Yep. Yes. So in a way, if I put it very simply, so the project is called civil obedience. So it's sort of the idea that we follow rules simply because they're the rules. And from a compliance perspective, we see this as something very positive. And what we're trying to understand is sort of, okay, where's this root thing in people that makes them want to do that? What is that exactly? So we're trying to get to that sort of Lego block, that sort of aspect. And I don't know if it's an individual trait or it's learned or socialized or whether it's in the broader culture. We're trying to find that. But we do know from the studies we've done so far that there is something like this. And we've developed a set of 12 questions. And we've studied this in many different places and many different people. They work really well. So the questions, you should always obey a legal rule, even if, and then we have 12 options. Other people don't obey this rule. The rule is not enforced. It's very costly to do so. The rule goes against your own morals, etc. So there's a check of 12 questions that we really validated in all the sort of psychological ways. So we're trying to use that to sort of find out the variation in that, but we go a bit further. So we live in a time, and this is sort of surprising, if you think about it, we have a very rapid distrust in government. I mean, increase in distrust in government. It's plummeted since COVID, a little bit before, and not just in the US, even in the Netherlands. So, and it's not just in politicians in general, it's in all kinds of institutions, even in courts. Second, we have mass polarization. So if you add those things up, we distrust the people that make and enforce the rules, and we don't agree on what those rules should be, and we violently don't agree on what those rules should be. Yet, and this is the funny thing that I observed, and I see also what you write on your blog about sort of this everyday compliance. If I look around me, I mean, I can look in two ways. One is I can look at what's wrong, but I can also look at where things are going right. So we live in these polarized, low trust societies, yet most people follow most rules. And that's an interesting thing. And that brings me back to the civil obedience. It's probably because most people just follow rules because they're rules. And that's why I want to understand this. So part of this research, we're going to sort of stress test this. So we're going to do experiments where we're trying to make the distrust and polarization more extreme to see at which point this sort of obligation to obey the rules breaks down in order then to see what interventions can we use to bolster it, even if it gets more extreme. So that's the second part of the research. And the third, which brings us also to civil obedience. So if I use the term civil obedience, you immediately know that there is something good about civil disobedience. And this is the funny thing about compliance and working compliance. We start to assume that being compliant is good. But we want to look at what are the sort of drawbacks of people having a high obligation to obey the law. First of all, we're going to look at, will those people still follow unjust rules? So what does it mean for having unjust rules if people are high on obligation to obey the law? This goes back a little bit, and we're not going to do that, to the sort of research that was done in the 1960s, Milgram experiments, prison experiments. I mean, these are basically things where we're trying to test how far are people obedient, even if everything's wrong. And second, we're going to look at what does it do for people who are supposed to enforce rules or deal with disputes if they're high in this obligation to obey law. Will that make them not look at the circumstances of the case? Will they maybe have unjust outcomes because they stick so much to the rules? So we're also looking at the downsides of this, which, so far as we know, hasn't really been done.
Wow. And I mean, you talk about that. It is interesting, isn't it? Because you're right. Compliance is a good thing. If people follow the rules, then the world's a better place. And of course, we need that. But it struck me as you were talking. One, if we think about things like creativity, that's all about breaking rules.
Exactly.
And so we don't want. Otherwise, we'd have a very boring existence. We don't want musicians to always follow rules. We don't want artists. We don't. And so
Yeah.
where does that stop? And if I think about R&D and some of the things that we need to have happen within
Yes.
organizations, it is people breaking rules. But then
Yep.
you also got to be thinking about the fact that we're set up on a and it varies according to what it is, but we're set up on a presumption of compliance. We presume that the way we design things, traffic lights would be a good example.
Yep.
They wouldn't work if we assumed that everybody was going to ignore them.
Yes. Well, this is, I think, exactly. Anthony Giddens, the sociologist from LSE, he's sort of written a book, The Consequences of Modernity, in which he sort of explains how can it be that we can even exist in these modern societies together? Because it's so complex. And for instance, if we're walking on the street or even with a horse, we don't need that many rules to be safe. But driving cars at the speeds that we do, you need to have a joint set of rules that everybody understands, takes for granted, and follows largely. Sure, we can all talk about that people are speeding to some extent, but they're still within the bounds of those rules. And I think red lights are a very good example. I mean, going through red lights is a very extreme thing to do, and you could say we probably comply with it because we agree with that rule because we know it's unsafe if we all don't do it, but also probably out of a sense that we've all learned that that's just the normal thing to do, and that there's just a basic set of rules we don't make everyday decisions on. We just follow them because they're the rules. And that's sort of where I want to go back to, is sort of understanding at the more individual human level where we are, but also how we got there in a social and a sort of national cultural sense.
I love the way your brain, because there's a sense of curiosity here, right? It's that you're
Yeah.
looking at it, and I'm assuming the more you study this, the more it kind of it's like it's just fascinating. How does it work? Why does it work? Why does it not work? All of these questions, and so I'm really struck that I guess you have to be curious to want to do what you do. But I'm
Yes.
fascinated by have you got a sense of what drives that curiosity in you? Because you're asking some questions that, I mean, you literally, I look at it as you are opening the box and going, well, what is going on here? And that's
Yes.
for a lot of people, that's awkward, right? There's lots of vested interest
Yes.
in you not succeed,
Yes.
right? You not doing that because you might expose that loads of things that we do are stupid, or that we've been
Yeah.
labeling under misapprehensions. And it questions, in many respects, you could say it questions the fabric of society. So I wonder, have you got a sense of what drives that curiosity in you?
I think part of the curiosity really comes of seeing the problem. So I do see a massive problem in this lack of trust and polarization. And I think a lot of people are working on sort of curing that. Great. They can do that. But I'm sort of curious, okay, in the societies that we have, how can we still keep some rule basis? I mean, but at the same time, how can we ensure that we still are critical enough to deal with unjust rules? So you need to find this sort of balance. And that interests me. I realize that this project, more than other projects I've done, is quite academic in terms of that it gets back to fundamental questions, and it's harder to sort of see, okay, how can we apply this? For instance, let's say we find that basically it's all about personality or about parenting. So I mean, going into the young kids, I'm also talking now with people who are in pedagogy and developmental psychology, who know everything about parenting and everything about sort of different styles of parenting, which, by the way, that literature on that is very similar to compliance sort of styles. So you have authoritative parenting that's all about punishment, and laissez-faire that doesn't care, and sort of this in between sort of responsive parenting that combines both for the case. But let's say we find it's parenting or personality. Well, nothing much we can do there anymore. At the time, we have these adults in our organization, right? And maybe we need to find out who is more at risk or not. But then we have all kinds of privacy or other concerns. Do we even want to know? Is this something that we can account for? So I do see that the sort of practical uses of this may be some obstacles, and that's well, sort of the position to be as an academic. You do have to ask sometimes the fundamental questions, even if you don't know yet what the application will be.
How is this impacting your propensity to obey laws and comply? And I'm not asking you to reveal any big secrets about how many rules you break on a daily basis, because you will, right? Because we all do. But
Oh yeah, no, it's really funny. I mean, that you asked this. When I do presentations, I often talk about some rule breaking I do. So one of the things that we have in the Netherlands, we have this rule against using your phone on your bike. And the rule has been there for 3 years now. There was first a higher fine, and then they lowered it a bit because it was quite high. And I live in the countryside. You have these really long bicycle lanes. They go on forever, and they're very broad. And everybody here, I mean, I see them in front of my office where I'm sitting now, has two hands on their phone, looking down, looking up every now and then. And they can do that perfectly safe and well. I do that. Well, I'm not a two thumb sort of a phone user. I'm a one thumb phone user, but I do that as well. I find, and I find myself doing that maybe not consciously, but in automated fashion because I'm addicted. Because let me check this, and before or I'll change the music on my phone. Before I know it, I'm checking my email. That's a good example of me doing something. I also look at sort of, okay, where would I be on the rule or on this sort of obligation to obey the law scale? I've never done it myself because I designed the skill, so I probably can't be tested on it very well. But I also see that with my kids, that I'm sort of looking at my kids. My son is now 16, my daughter is 15. Where would they be? So yes, I do look at this from my own life, and I'm pretty aware of my own sort of behaviors, but also aware that I'm not aware.
and does it make you it's always easier to spot certain negative things, right? Stuff that my always my loose terminology, but the big question of what pisses you off, and I'm a big
Yes,
proponent of things that piss us off. Cool, that's
yes,
potentially problematic, and we need to keep an eye on it from a behavioural perspective.
yes,
And sometimes it's entirely unnecessary. Are you more alive to this? Are you walking around with a sort of behavioural lens on everything? And because I could imagine, I find it quite exhausting when I'm looking for sort of compliance in the wild examples, and I'm paying more
yes,
attention to it's in a slightly weird way. And it occurred to me, if you're looking at this stuff all the time, I mean, there's a wealth of things. You pointed out cycling as one example, but there's all aspects of our lives are now governed by these things. Is this exhausting
yes.
for you, or can you switch off?
No, I can switch off. I mean, I made a little hobby a while back. I had a Facebook page called Reg Science that I made with Jeroen van der Heijden, who's also a regulatory scholar. So we looked for, and it's still probably on there somewhere on Facebook. I should revive it and put it on Instagram or something. But it is pictures of signage, mostly governmental, sometimes private, that tries to shape our behavior. And if possible, I try and include in the picture somebody breaking the rule on the sign.
Not you. It's not. Like
No, it's
commissioning if you
people.
go, here's a stupid rule, let me photograph myself.
No, no, no. So the best one I ever found. So I've really weird ones like don't drive with a golf cart here. I mean that's
That's
very
very specific,
specific.
right?
Yes, but no, the one that I like best is at some point in China I saw a sign that had a tree on it and then a big red cross through it. So it meant don't plant trees here, and it was right underneath a power line. And actually, there was a tree growing right beneath the sign. But if you think of it, who plants trees? It's the government. Who puts the sign there? It's also the government. So it's one part of the government telling another part of the government not to plant trees under the power line. And I just love that. And also what I love about science is somebody designs these things. So if you think of the love of it, and for instance, I have so many kinds of signs of toilets. So sort of sure there's the sort of modern ones that don't have a sex anymore, but the old ones. So for instance, in China at some point I found a nut for female and a screw for male. And at UCLA, I saw, and I first only saw the male one. I saw the male, the normal male, but then holding at the law school at UCLA Law School, holding a briefcase. And I thought that was sexist, but then I saw the female same skirt, but then with briefcase. So no, there's a lot of nice science, and the whole study of how science shape behavior and work is fascinating. So I like, but I take pictures of the science not so much for the behavioral part, more for the design part. Like in South Korea, they have all these weird. I mean, I haven't been, but my colleague was. These weird sort of cartoons that are always in the science. It's really funny. Yeah.
But I love that. And to your point, as an aside, I discovered the other day how expensive like road signs are
Yeah.
because they were doing this was in Germany. They were refreshing signs that aren't direction signs but point to like tourist destinations.
Yep.
And so towns have them, to talk about our wonderful gardens or something that's supposed to encourage people who are driving past to think, oh, well, let's go and have a look at this. Right. And it was some obscene, I know there's privatization, but it was some obscene amount of money, something like
Yep.
€1 million for a sign. It
Wow.
was that sort of level of order because of all the crap that goes with it and all the rules and so I think it's really interesting you made that point because it's not, we can, you can imagine a situation where somebody teachers do this quite a lot, where they're trying, the class is getting a bit unruly, so they'll try something, or parents, right? Where the cost of a
Yep.
new experiment is
Yep.
the marginal cost is non-existent, and you have to do something. Whereas signs is a conscious effort to do it.
Yep.
And so I love that. I think it's a really good illustration of it. It's a little bit like legislation. Somebody has
Yep.
written this stuff, crafted it. It's been discussed, hopefully debated and thought about. So I love that.
Yep.
Love that point because often, what I find fascinating, and this applies to the broader compliance thing. You often see things where you just go, "Why did they think that was a good idea?" And you don't
Yep.
even need to be behaviorally sophisticated to recognize why it's
No.
stupid.
Yes. I mean, the funny thing about science is, so the research on this, and I don't know how well it replicates, but there's been a study carried out in the Netherlands that I also described in the behavioral code, where they put signs, where they compared the effect of a sign in a place where there was compliance with the sign, and then compared it to a situation where there was non-compliance with the sign. So you have four groups. You have, there's compliance and non-compliance, and there's no sign. And then they look at, for instance, littering. So there's a lot of littering on the street, or there's no littering on the street. And then you look at, okay, are people going to litter more or less? So we know they're going to litter more if there's littering than when there's no littering. Then they put the sign there. So the sign reduces littering even further in an environment that's clean. But in an environment where there already is litter, actually the sign makes it worse. And the interesting thing is why? And the reason why that these authors say is, well, if you put a sign in a place where it's often broken, not only will people see that a lot of people break the rule, but they also will see, so this rule has no power. So it undermines the power of the rules. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, because often what we do when we see non-compliance, we say, oh, here's the rule, you should be doing this. Same with parenting. But if you do that a lot and the behavior itself doesn't change, well, only thing you're doing is undermining your own authority.
It's expending effort to make things worse.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. But it's interesting because I see the opposite. The other day I was So I get a traffic ticket every now and then. And I'm not, I mean, if you ask my friends, I don't drive that fast, but I drive over the speed limit sometimes somewhere, and often it's on a place that I don't know. And what I see nowadays, if I don't have my app on where I can see the speed limit the whole time in my app, it's actually quite hard to know in some roads what the speed limit is because they don't have enough signs. So there can be places where this is important.
Right, right, yeah. Well, no, it was interesting actually because I rented a car the other day and I was driving in Scotland, and obviously the modern cars, the sat nav is plugged into, it gets a data feed, and so the speed
Yep.
limit was, it was updated for road. There were literally roadworks that had been there for a day, I think,
Yeah.
and the system had updated it. And I thought that's a really interesting
Wow.
illustration of, yeah, because I,
Yep.
I I sort of expect it for roads that have been there for some time, but actually this
Yep.
was smart enough where they'd taken real time data, and
Yep.
I was just like, that actually is interesting because it's to your point is, I think a lot
Yep.
of these things is through ignorance.
Sure. I mean, here you get to a next level thing. I mean, I had this discussion last year about a conference about AI and compliance. And some of the people were there like, well, we can use AI or automated systems so that if you speed, your car would inform the authorities and you would automatically get a ticket. I said, that's crazy. So you're trying to use an AI system to create an incentive for you not to speed. Whereas you could do it much easier. And I understand that there are some political problems here. If the cars know you're speeding, and most cars can self-drive to a certain extent, couldn't a car keep you within a bound of the maximum speed limit? I mean,
Right.
that's not that hard. And you could still override it maybe with a button or something for safety reasons, or if you really want to speed and get a ticket because you maybe still want to have some autonomy. But I think the sort of default being, well, you can't go that, let's say 20% beyond the speed limit. And the car knows nowadays what the speed limit is, as you said, in an updated way. I mean, I just found it fascinating that we use this new technology to then go back to this age-old system of having tickets, which we hope keep people from speeding, for which there is some evidence. I mean, speeding, we do know that that fines do work, but it's much more direct to just say, well, you can't go beyond a safe, a sort of, exceeding of the speed limit.
It's funny you mentioned that because I've seen exactly the same sorts of things. It's like there's this drive to push that, and it's almost, it's legacy thinking that then just gets
Yes,
digitized. And so
yes,
as you were talking, I was thinking, well, this is almost the same logic as we have in the sort of, we want to look good in the courtroom. It's like we'll keep
yes,
the same overall construct, but
yes,
we'll just
yes,
modernize it a bit.
yeah. I mean, it's because we cannot imagine that we could get the political support to actually get more directly into the drive seat, where there is some evidence for that. So, for instance, good example is how in the early 70s, and this also in the behavioral code, U.S. Congress, no, yeah, they adopted a law that forbade the highway authority in the U.S. to have a ignition lock in cars that would force people to use their seatbelts. I mean, basically, the national legislature said, stay out of my decision to wear a seatbelt. And that's an interesting thing. And I think that generally applies to these sort of factual interventions, which we do have for some things like speed bumps. I mean, they are also very factual. They're very hard. They force you into a slower mode. But somehow we don't really want to do that with other options we have now that are more modern, like having automated checks on your speeding.
And that's an interesting point because one of the things that's been striking me is that depending on the domain, depends on what you're allowed to do. And so
Yep.
there are certain, if I
Yep.
looked at
Yep.
cybersecurity, for example, it
Yep.
seems to be acceptable to engage
Yes.
in entrapment, where you send people fake phishing emails, and then
Yep.
the worst companies punish people and send them on more training. The best ones use that intelligently, but that's effectively entrapment. If you did entrapment with, I don't know, bribery, right?
Yep.
Let's just drop some money on people's desks and see what they
Yeah.
do with it, right? See if they
Yeah.
report it.
Yeah.
People would be outraged. And so it really strikes
Yes.
me that when you talk
Yes.
about a lot of these things, it's
Yes.
very, very context dependent as to what
Yes.
we're prepared to
Yes.
experiment with,
Yes.
allowed to do from an ethical perspective.
Yes. It's interesting that you mentioned cybersecurity. So cybersecurity has some of the most accepted factual intervention, which are firewalls. So we make it harder for people to engage in cybersecurity because we have software protecting you. somehow we don't take that same ideas, for instance, as I said earlier, to speeding or using the phone in your car or to more complex things. I mean, it's interesting where we do use this sort of what I call situational approach or opportunity approach, and where we don't. We use it for terrorists, but we don't use it for other violent crime as much. I mean, it has been used in UK in pubs. I don't know if you've heard about this. To prevent glassings in pubs, they developed new glasses in pubs that are made of unbreakable plastic, which is exactly the same idea. You have a problem. I mean, people are stabbing each other in pubs. You study how it happens, and then you think about, okay, what can we change in the pub at the lowest cost that reduces the harm of it happening? And that's not a way of thinking that we often use in all domains. We use it in some and not in others. So I fully agree with you.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I was vaguely aware of that. Obviously, I'm not an aficionado of glassing people in pubs, but
No.
it's interesting because I think one of the things that then points to, if we take it into a corporate environment,
Yeah.
is some of the creative solutions that we could come up with, and recognizing that, you were talking about the scale of the challenge, and
Yeah.
you're going to go to some dark places that will be very, very problematic, even
Yeah.
if it's for companies, but if we looked at it, some of the creative solutions that we might come up with, we're not allowed to come up with.
Yeah.
And so we're not allowed to we're not allowed to think in those terms. And some of that is, of course, behavioral in of itself,
Yeah.
but some of it is
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
it's just sort of not contemplated or
Yes.
not
Yes.
permitted.
So what I find, I mean, if you talk about the lawyer perspective, what I find most fascinating is our sort of focus on privacy. So I've seen several instances where concerns for privacy are near taken at, okay, that's the only consideration. If it breaks privacy, we can't do any of it. I would love it to be that we can say, okay, that's one of the important considerations, but there's several. So again, if I go, I mean, if I go back to COVID, for instance, so there was a time where we didn't have vaccines, where there still was the first sort of first the first variants, still a lot of people dying, and where we still had lockdowns, where a lot of people were locked down with tremendous cost. And at the time, people were thinking of maybe the solution would be an app where people who have been in contact with people in disease could be tracked or followed and could be influenced in that way and kept safe. There were different ways into that. And I had colleagues who immediately said, but that's a safety concern, and hence we cannot do that. And I responded when they asked me to also come on board in that argument. I said, sure, that's a big concern, but I would like to see the overall concerns. I would say our freedom, which includes privacy, but our freedom is also very much restricted by these lockdowns. So if we can get out of lockdowns by sacrificing a bit of privacy, but in a regulated way, maybe we should consider that. And I just found a lot of people immediately said, no, we can never consider that. And that's an interesting example, I think, where we are not taking the full costs and benefits of the problem and its solution into account.
Which is weird because we do that in other contexts. And in fact, we all intuitively know everything's a trade-off.
Yes.
Right, we know that when we make a decision, there's opportunity cost, there's alternative courses of action or inaction.
Yep.
They're available. And so for some reason, I think it's really, I find it fascinating because this points to some of the idiocies that we observe.
Yep.
And it's a lot of my work is kind of, I go with people and sort of, why are you doing it that way? And we don't even, in some cases, we don't even need to test it, right? Because we know that when we start to look at it, go, that's really silly.
Yes.
Right? It's just obviously stupid. And so a lack of imagination and
Yep.
creativity.
Yep.
And it's interesting
Yep.
when you talk about it in those
Yep.
terms, because I think it's almost, I mean, compliance is probably the last place, the word compliance innovation
Yep.
feels like an oxymoron in
Yes.
some cases. And yet,
So what you just said reminded me of the Elon Musk biography by Walter Isaacson. And look, we can say a lot about Elon Musk, but there was one thing that I found interesting, that from the start, he's asked the question, if he comes across a rule that doesn't make sense for his business, he wants to find out who made this rule, the person, the actual person or persons, and interview them. Why do we have this rule? And I think that's an interesting way of going about this. I think you're right in saying sort of part of the problem with compliance is that we've all been sort of maybe too following, too obedient to even question why we have rules. I think there are quite some rules, including many operationalized through compliance programs, that maybe don't really protect the valid interest or are just part of a trade-off. And that if we're going to focus on just having that sort of procedural rule being complied with, might do more harm than it does good. So I do think a sort of critical look at what are the rules? What are the trade-offs here? Why do we have those? Is important. Of course, the downside of that is if everybody starts to do this, we don't have a rule-based society. But that goes back to this heart of this question of civil obedience. When do we need to question the rules and when shouldn't we? Which I think is a valid thing to ask more in compliance. And I think we are lacking, and also me, sufficiently thinking about this sort of question. Okay, when should we actually be critical of the idea of compliance itself?
I love that, but I really like that. I haven't read that book actually, so I must do that. But I like the idea of going and speaking to the person, because I think one of the things that we often do when I see, I see a lot of people doing a sort of simple thing going, well, you can only have a new policy if you get rid of one, or new bit of training if you
Yep.
get rid of another, one in, one
Yep.
out type
Yep.
logic. And I understand the attraction of that, but that presupposes that they're all equal.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and and actually, it also presupposes that we can make an assessment as to the efficacy of it. Which back
Yep.
to the point, often these things haven't ever been tested, so we're scrapping things without really knowing. But I love that piece of going back and actually trying to speak to the person that came up with it, because I think
Yes.
often they could have come up with it for a brilliant reason,
Yep.
a really really shrewd observation, not so. And it might have manifested itself in a really bureaucratic way,
Yes.
but actually, what's underpinning it is
Yep.
incredibly sensible.
Yes.
There's something lost in translation.
Yeah. And you might find out, okay, that's one interest, but there's multiple others. And obviously it's different if you're, yeah, really dominant in a certain market and with an economic interest like Elon Musk is, so he may be able to talk to legislators where most of us can't. Yeah. I mean, in the end, finding out the person who wrote the rule at some point is going to be a legislator or a drafter at some department. But I think the- getting back to that, it might also mean that you can more easily convince people to start following rules if you can explain better why they're there.
Yes. Yeah. Because it always strikes me there's an interesting thing. And on the one hand, if I look at compliance programs, there's an absolute desire to train people on the legacy and origins of rules. And we call training after the regulation. I
Yep.
use our language, not the language of the people they don't care. They're not interested in this stuff, but here's the history of this rule. And so on the one hand, we do that. On the other hand, we often don't explain things at all.
No.
And so there's this strange sort of, you either get a history lesson in the detail of it, which is not
Yep.
relevant, or you get nothing at all. It's assumed knowledge that you'll understand why it's a good thing.
Yes. And also making it, I mean, showing people, look, we understand this comes at a cost. We understand this is difficult, but this is the reasons why we choose this trade-off. And I think that might help. But again, this is not something I study directly. And again, we're back to the efficacy question, especially for more complex things.
Wow. So I just love having these conversations with you, because your brain goes to some really interesting places. I love the fact that there's someone, I keep saying this every time I have a conversation with you, but I love the fact there's someone like you out there doing what you do and asking these questions. And I would say, please keep going, even if the answers are uncomfortable, unhelpful, or not practically implementable. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's a word.
Yep.
Because I just think I love the fact that you exist and you're doing this stuff, because I think it's, even if the findings aren't anything particularly that we can do anything with, I think what you're doing is almost as much power just asking these questions and giving people like me the right to ask them, because I can lean on the fact that you exist and just go, well, legit to ask these questions, right? Here's some people that are doing it in detailed ways. And so I wanted to say thank you for giving me permission, both, I think, just from a sort of norms perspective, that it's okay to ask this because they're being asked in academic thing. But I think the second thing is some of the things that you point towards, that even if you take us into some deep dives, just the direction of travel. I mean, that point there that says actually we should start to ask questions about, is people reading something? Is that helpful or not? I think it's a really important thing to understand, because the inbuilt presumption is that it must be, right?
Yes.
You read something and you'll be better off having read it.
Yes. Yes.
And so just the fact that that's up for challenge, I think is really powerful.
Thank you. Well, also for me, it helps a lot to talk with you because the questions you ask me also push me further in my own question. And I think that's, so if you ever have any weird questions or anything, I mean, keep asking me, because I'd love to be inspired.
You got it. I will put links to your fabulous books and your previous appearances on the show and your social media as well, which is always fabulously enjoyable, in the show notes. But Benjamin, once again, thank you so much for a conversation that was unpredictable, but I think in its broad breadth and interest, absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. That was great.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Benjamin for appearing again, and to you for listening. To find out more about Benjamin, his research, his books, including the brilliant Behaviour Code, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. And of course, his previous appearances on the show. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed in the past, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. And if you like the show and have yet to leave a rating or a review for it, please do so on whichever platform you're listening to. It really does help. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that we should all question compliance from time to time. And thank you so much for listening.